Okay, welcome to the next part of the Dutch landscape. We've been discussing the natural processes in the former lectures, and today we're going to make a start with the cultural landscapes. And we're going to start on the sandy soils, as these sandy soils are traditionally inhabited for the longest period of time because it was dry. There was no transgression going on, there was no fear that your house might be overflown by the ocean, and people have been living on the sandy soils for far longer than they've been living in the west of the Netherlands. Even, though when we look at the Netherlands right now, we tend to focus our attention more towards the clays and the peats in the west because that's where the Randstad is and that's where we make our money today. Those cities over there, they are brand new, and the cities in the east of the Netherlands, for example, the Hanse, etc., those are a lot older. And even before there were cities, there were villages, and even before there were villages, there were isolated farms on the sandy soil. So these this traditional way of living of the sandy soil people is thousands of years older than all that newer stuff in the West. So this is the Netherlands, and the book says that about 40% of the Netherlands is covered in cover sands. Well, I've taken a map of the Altera search engine, and everything that is yellow here and over there is cover sand. And as you can see, the part that is, greenish or pinkish, either peats or clays, like with us and in Friesland and Groningen, or in the middle here, this is river clays, obviously. That is a lot less than 60%. So I don't know how the book gets to the 40%. What they do is they leave out the Veluwe, for example, because I assume that it's because they are push moraines, etc. But it's cover sand. So I'd say about 70% of the Netherlands, at least, is covered in cover sands. And make no mistake, they say loam is red, and then South Limburg is completely covered in loam, and then there's some loam here. And this is not the boulder loam, ladies and gentlemen. This is only what's on the surface of the Netherlands, and the boulder loam is always covered. So this is a different type of loam. This is loess. And loess and loam, basically the same thing. If you make the deposit of silt, which is very, very fine, dried out clay particles, and you make it wet, you tend to have these very fine, very, very fine, almost porcelain-like clays, and that is what we call loam. And we have that basically leem in Dutch here in southern Limburg. So this has got nothing to do with the boulder loam. Now, as you can see, there's a part of the cover sands that is South Limburg and the north of the north of Limburg and South Brabant, and then mostly Gelderland, Overijssel, Drenthe, and southern part of Groningen, and a big part of Friesland as well, is still covered in cover sands. So what do we know about cover sands? Well, we know that it's deposited through the wind in the Weichsel Ice Age, and this is the part of the Netherlands that is higher than +1 NAP, and it's untouched by the transgression. Maybe there is some peats growing here. We'll see that in a second when we take a look at one of the villages here in Drenthe. Maybe there is some peats over here because there is some boulder loam in the ground and the water cannot go away, and then you have these fens. But the real transgression areas, that's over here and over here, the rivers. And this part of the Netherlands has been kept mostly untouched during the Holocene. Now, a question. What exactly is sand? Well, we already know that sand is something that we can touch. We can pick it up from the floor. It is a solid material, and we can see the individual grains of sand with our naked eye. And I've taken rather coarse sand right here, and I've zoomed in quite a bit, and you can see that all of these little individual grains are quite visible, and some of them have different colors, and that's because they have different minerals in them. And the white material that you see right here, all the white particles, which is by far the most common mineral there is quartz. SiO2. It's silica. Now, some of you have had NOSC, and you immediately see that there is one silicium atom combined with two oxygen atoms, making up the SiO2 silica molecule. And this is why we can make glass out of sand. Because when we melt the sand, these silica minerals, they become liquid, and the Si, the silicium, that tends to flow together, and we have glass, and we can look through it. We have to make sand very, very warm, roughly about 4,000 degrees. I think it's 3,500 or so. And then you can make glass. Now, there is also some other stuff in between, maybe some, I don't know, olivine, I think this is. I'm not a mineralogist, so I'm not really sure. Maybe some micas. Basically, sand is nothing more than a rock that has been hit against another rock for a bunch of times, and then everything in the rock basically breaks off and becomes a tinier particle. And in the end, the minerals, the clay minerals, they will weather out of the rock, and you'll end up with silicium oxide. And a rule for sand is that it has to be granular, so there has to be individual grains that you can't see by eye, and they have to be smaller than gravel and bigger than silt, which comes down to they have to be bigger than 1/16th of a millimeter, and they have to be maximum 2 millimeters big. If they're bigger than this, there's a different name for it. It's called gravel. It's what we have on very old tennis courts. I think most of these tennis courts have been changed, but I used to play on gravel. And if it's smaller, then it's called silt, and it's what loess is made of, and it's what loam is made of. And these are different minerals most of the time. So the most important part is silica, SiO2, and especially on our beaches where we have mixed shells, CaCO3 or calcium carbonate is mixed in. This is made by life. So, I don't know, a mussel makes a shell, the mussel dies, the shell gets put on the beach, and weathering and erosion sets in and makes this into very tiny grains of CaCO3 or calcium carbonate. It's not a difficult word. Anyway, sand is usually a mixture, and this is the most important bit. And why is that important? Well, SiO2, silicium oxide, or silica, or quartz, all words meaning the same different thing, is very infertile. Here we have it. This is the Netherlands 5,000 years ago. This is somewhere near Kootwijk, I think. I took this picture. And not a lot grows on bare sand. In fact, nothing grows here. And first we have to have a lot of pioneer plants to sort of make a fertile layer for other plants before these trees can start to grow. And these trees grow on very sour soil because this SiSO2 mixed with water makes an acid. So these soils tend to be very acidic. And 3,000 years ago, so 2,000 years of soil building by this, pioneer plant over here, turns this into a heath field. This is basically the only thing that can grow on these very sour, very devoid of nutrients, very infertile soil types that we find in the east of the Netherlands. Where the west of the Netherlands, with the young marine deposits and the old marine deposits, the clays, is very fertile. It is almost the best soil in the world. The east of the Netherlands and large parts of Germany, where there is only sand, are very sour, very infertile soils, and basically nothing grows that we can eat. People cannot live off the heath. People cannot eat a tree. We are not giraffes. It doesn't work. We cannot, it's got celluloses in it and it's got mostly twigs, and our stomachs, we cannot digest it. We need berries or maybe a little bit of meat, or we need fruits. We need some vegetables, but it doesn't really work that well either. So what do when it's 1850? Well, what you do is you go to these wild lands where nothing is growing, or not, at least not a lot, and you let the sheep, who can digest heath and who can digest the grasses, you let them do the eating for you, and then you have a very, very cool trick to make something happen on your own acres. But more on that later. This is mostly what it looks today. More on how this changed, this landscape of 1850, how that flipped over to this in the next lecture. Anyway, this is our geofactors figure. And we have been talking a lot about how a landscape is formed as a result of climate and substrate, rock and relief, and then flora, fauna, soil, water, and air. And this is where man comes in. Man has really, really changed all these landscapes, and they started in the soil department. We are going to take a look at this relationship right here. This is a soil. If I dig a hole, this is called an anti-soil. You can forget about this word. I think it's, if you remember this one for R4 or R5 or R6, I don't know when you're going to do this again, but if you remember that, it's very important. This is a soil type where there is nothing going on. There is almost no life except for this little grass root of pioneer grass. And there is no horizons in the earth. This is just sand stacked upon other sand. It's the most infertile soil. Nothing can live here except the first pioneer plants who need basically nothing to live, who can just live off the CO2 in the atmosphere. And this only occurs when there is a stable supply of fresh sediments blowing in almost without plant growth. So this is what the Netherlands and the cover sand soils looked like, let's say 10,000 years ago at the beginning of the Holocene. Now the only mineral in this thing will be SiO2, and it's hardly anything for a plant to eat or drink because water will just sink. Now, this is a soil that we have in the Netherlands a lot. This is called a potsoil soil, which is a term you might remember. And here you see that these plants, these tiny, grasses, they've been growing for a while, and then they've been dying in the winter, and then they've been decaying. And that's a layer you see over here. This is a layer of humus. And humus contains plant material, which is plants that have died, basically. So they die, they fall on the floor, a new layer of sand is covering them, and other plants, they can now feed off their dead bodies that are in the first layer of humus. Now this is a good thing because humus is nutrients for other plants. But what's going on here? This is a layer devoid of humus. All the humus has been leached out. This is a process called leaching. It's in in Dutch you say uitspoelen. So rain falls, it percolates into the ground and takes everything that is worth any mineral content from this layer, and then it leaves it over here. And this is a very, very large area in Russia where they have these puzzle soils, which is where the words comes from. And it's Russian, it means under ash. So this is the layer of ash that these Russians are referring to. It's really, really, really grayish, as if you burned a relative member and buried it in. There's almost like a layer of ash. Don't burn your relatives. It's not nice. I have a brother too. I would never burn him. Never. Anyway, when these Russian farmers were plowing through their fields, they would find that the good stuff, the layer with all the minerals, is actually buried under a layer of ash, which is why they call this a podzol, under ash type of soil. And a raindrop leaches everything here and then puts it in this layer, which is called elevation. The Dutch word would be inspoeling. So uitspoeling here, inspoeling there, leaching here, elevation over there. And there are three distinct horizons in this soil. So there's the humus layer, then you have the ash layer, then you have the elevation layer, and then you have the layer where nothing happens because this is just, the cover sand basically. And it's a bit yellow because it's got some calcium carbonate in it. All right. So after about 1,000 years, a couple of 1,000 years of plants growing, plants dying, there is a humus layer now, and an ash layer, and the rain made sure that there was some pretty fertile soil over here. You just have to plow this regularly. Now this is a map of the east of the Netherlands, and we've all been here because this over here, this village, is Westdorp in Drenthe, which is where we were at Brugklaskamp. Now this is my favorite map that I have in my house. I have an atlas of 1864. So this is Westdorp, the village where we were at camp, at 1864. And you can see, well, it's hard to see, but you can see that there is a stream of water coming this way, and there is a lot of communal. Actually, this is better. Here you have Westdorp again, and here you have the stream of water, and then here, this is Schoonlo, by the way. You have the weide, some names apparently, and these are the acres of where the people farmed their crops. And as you can see, the rest of the map is very, very empty. Ellertsveld, Zwedische Veld. A lot of empty fields. The world was a very empty place in the Netherlands in 1864. And the idea is that this was the way for these people to deal with infertile soil. So all of this was very infertile, and what they did was they made a small portion of the land around the village very fertile. But there wasn't any artificial fertilizer yet, so how did they do it? Well, you have these empty heath fields where nobody lives, except maybe some robbers. And what you do is you take a bunch of sheep and you go there, and every day these sheep eat the heath that you cannot eat, and these sheep, they graze, and in their tummies, that heath is made into poo. And every night you bring them here This is in potstal. I have no idea what the English word is, and I'm too lazy to Google it. This is the communal shed, I think is the best word for it. And all the sheep, they go in, and then they do their business. And the manure that the sheep let go over here is going to be your fertilizer for your fields. So all of this empty field over here, the Westerdorpse veld, this is some peat, Ellertsveld over here, that was necessary for all the sheep of the village to make sure that these lands were fertile. It was a pretty good system. These sheep were not held for the wool, they were not held for the meat, they were not held for the milk, they were held for the fact that they could digest heath, something that we cannot, and make it into fertilizer, make it into shit, essentially. So this would be a cross-section of the average village in the Netherlands. Let's say that this is Westdorp. Then this is the area where you actually make the stuff that you want to eat. And you take some litter from the woods, you take some hay sods from the riverbed, you put them to mix them together with a lot of manure, and you put them on your fields, and those fields are called essen or enken. It doesn't really matter where you go in the Netherlands. It's either going to be enk or es. The English word is open field. And I have some pictures of that later. And you put those manure and hay sods and litters, you put them on there, so these fields, those essen and enke, they become bigger and bigger and bigger. And here we have a picture of the Enkeerd soil. So it's the same word in Dutch. I really tried Googling yesterday for a good English translation of Enkeerd soil. I couldn't find it. Anybody knows the English word for it? Hey, you're smarter than me. Congratulations. Basically, what this is a layer of 1,000 years of habituation of putting sods and litter from the woods and sheep shit together, mixing it up in order to make this infertile, soury soil, silica, sand soil into something you can actually use for crops. Now, it's an extremely thick layer, sometimes half a meter to a meter, and you can see these enke and esse in the landscape immediately because they are significantly higher than the rest of the surroundings. So you have, for example, an area near Holte, and everything is flat, and then suddenly the field itself is almost half a meter higher. Then hey, that's an old enk, and they raised it above the sublayer because the sublayer is useless, and they had to make their own fertile soil. So that's how they did it, and it was hard work. Here you see a couple of guys, I don't know, in Drenthe somewhere, and they were literally raising the field. This guy is I don't know what he's doing, overseeing this guy, maybe helping. I don't know, but this guy is working very hard. It was complete poverty. People we tend to romanticize this old period of Dutch traditional living on the sandy soils, and we tend to say that the landscapes were beautiful, and we need more heath, and we more open fields, and artificial fertilizer has destroyed so much. But truth of the matter was that these guys living in circumstances like this, it was terrible. It was absolutely Africa style poverty. If you were a kid, you would be a sheep herder, and you would never learn how to read or write. This is on the Zijpenberg, which is a pushmoraine in the Netherlands somewhere on the Veluwe, and it was just really, really terrible. And now we tend to romanticize living like that in drawings like this, while in fact it was terrible. So, in short, the sandy soils, they were fertilized by sheep manure, litter, picking hay sods, in order to get a bigger yield from the communal Enke and Esse around the village. And that was a traditional way of life for a long time, and everybody in the village basically worked to get that done. And sometimes, if the sheep ate too much of the heath, then there was no pioneers vegetation anymore to hold down the soil, and you get this. This is in Kootwijk. This is the Dutch desert. I've shown you these pictures before because it's a very beautiful, very strange place in the middle of the Netherlands. And Kootwijk is one of those brink villages, and they had to rebuild it a couple of times because when the wind is coming from the wrong direction, this sand tends to go to Kootwijk. And this is one of the biggest ecological disasters in the Netherlands because this was Kootwijkerveld, and a lot of people had a lot of sheep to produce a lot of manure to get some grain and some, potatoes and beans and what have you. And everybody went here with their sheep, and then they ate all the pioneer plants, and there was nothing left to hold down the soil. And now you have the Kootwijker zandverstuiving, so the shifting dunes of Kootwijk in English. And it's a very remarkable place, especially if you go to Radio Kootwijk as well, which is a very, very interesting place. Beautiful building in the middle of a very, very lonely, spooky place, basically. So it's one of the biggest ecological disasters in the Netherlands. Is when you have too many sheep on these very infertile and therefore very vulnerable soil types. These things happen, and it's a disaster for the village because now where are you gonna have your sheep? You're gonna have to move them somewhere else.